The first thing I felt wasn't the pain, but the shocking cold of the slate floor against my cheek. A moment before, I had been standing. Now the world was sideways, and a jagged agony was tearing through my shoulder, a bone grinding where it shouldn't be. My son's wife, Serafina, stood over me, her face a mask of placid fury, not a single strand of her perfect blonde hair out of place. My son, Corbin, stood by the fireplace, his hands in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the dying embers, as if the sound of his mother's body hitting the floor was nothing more than a log shifting in the grate. He said nothing. 3 days later, his text message lit up my phone, a sterile blue glow in the darkness of my bedroom. I would rather lose my mother than lose my wife. 10 words to sever a lifetime. I didn't reply. I simply let the silence answer for me, a silence that grew until his name was systematically erased from the $15 million estate and the sprawling 1,000-acre cattle ranch that bore our family name. Then, as if he'd noticed a draft from a window I'd finally shut, came the dinner invitation. They arrived smiling. I remained a fortress of quiet civility. When my silence failed to yield the unconditional surrender they expected, Serafina, with the grace of a striking cobra, poured a tureen of lukewarm vichyssoise over my head. Corbin's hand shot out, not to help me, but to grab my throat. He slapped me, the crack of it echoing in the cavernous dining room, his voice a venomous hiss as he disowned me. And in that precise moment, as if summoned by the sheer force of his betrayal, the front door flew open. What kind of justice is there in a world where the child you raised becomes your executioner? It happened on a Thursday, a late dinner at my table, in my house. I had baked sourdough, braised a brisket, and churned fresh butter, setting out the meal with the same care I had when Corbin was a boy of 10, convinced that a perfect meal could mend a broken bond. It was meant to be an olive branch, a return to something resembling normalcy. I had allowed myself to hope that the storm had passed, that Serafina's volatile temper had settled, that just for one evening I could lower my guard. She arrived in stilettos that punctured the antique hardwood floors and a crimson dress cut so low it was an act of aggression, as if she were attending the funeral of our relationship and wanted to be the most striking mourner. Corbin trailed her, a ghost in a tailored suit, handing me a bottle of overpriced Cabernet I hadn't asked for. He kissed my cheek, a dry, papery touch, and asked if dinner was ready. The air at the table was thick with unspoken resentments. Serafina moved the food around her plate with the tip of her fork, a surgeon dissecting a failed experiment. Corbin's attention was tethered to the screen of his phone. I tried to bridge the chasm, asking about the new Colt they'd bought, mentioning a documentary I'd watched. My words fell into the void and vanished. Finally, Serafina pushed her plate away. "Do you ever just stop?" she asked, her tone deceptively casual. "Stop orchestrating everything. This house, the ranch, Corbin's schedule. It's exhausting watching you play queen of this dusty little kingdom." I looked at my son. He refused to meet my eyes, his focus locked on his phone's screen as if it held the secrets to the universe. I kept my voice a low, steady hum. "This is my home, Serafina. I am offering hospitality, not control." She let out a laugh that sounded like ice cracking. "You want to offer something?" she said, her fingers tightening around the stem of her wineglass. And in one fluid, vicious motion, she hurled the dark red liquid into my face. It blinded me, the alcohol stinging my eyes, the cold liquid shock of it stealing my breath. As I gasped, fumbling for a napkin, Corbin's chair scraped back. Before I could even wipe the wine from my chin, his hand, the same hand that once clung to mine in crowded marketplaces, swung through the air and connected with my cheek. The force of it snapped my head to the side. "Just stop," he snarled, his voice a stranger's. "You're ruining everything." I didn't scream, I didn't weep. I simply rose from my chair, the wine dripping from my jawline like blood, and walked out of the room. Behind me, I heard Seraphina's triumphant, crystalline laughter. Corbin did not follow. In the stark light of the bathroom mirror, the reflection was of a woman aged a decade in an hour. The angry red welt on my cheek was blooming. I cleaned myself with a slow, deliberate calm, not because I was afraid, but because there were no words left to say that hadn't already been demonstrated with such brutal clarity. That night, the text message arrived, the final nail in the coffin of the mother I used to be. I sat on the edge of my bed, the phone heavy in my hand, and let the truth settle into my bones. Then I opened the bottom drawer of my nightstand and pulled out the estate binder, its leather cover worn smooth by the years. Page by page, I traced the lines of my life's work, the deeds to the land, the trust documents, the pending transfers of assets. Corbin's name was everywhere, a beneficiary in waiting, not yet finalized, still within my grasp. I closed the binder, the weight of it in my lap, a grounding force. I don't know what other mothers would have done. I don't know if they would have found a way to forgive, to try again, to build another bridge, only to watch it burn. But for me, something had irrevocably fractured. I would not be a mother who begged for scraps of love from her own child's table. I would be a woman who owned the table, the chairs, and the house they sat in. If you have ever been made to feel like a guest in your own life, ask yourself this: how long will you tolerate those who have already decided you are disposable? That was the last night I allowed my worth to be determined by anyone else. And the first night I remembered, with chilling precision, exactly who I was. The next morning I was up before the sun, the skin on my cheeks still tender and hot. I bypassed the kitchen and went directly to the records room at the back of the house, a place that smelled of old paper and cedar. I unlocked the third drawer of the steel file cabinet and pulled out the heavy black binder labeled Vance Estate Plan. I carried it to the dining room table and sat in the very chair Corbin had occupied the night before. I opened it and began the methodical dismantling of my son's future. Land titles, 1,000 acres of prime Montana ranch land, all in my name. Investment portfolios, trust funds, retirement accounts. His name, Corbin Vance, was listed as the pending sole beneficiary. The transfer documents, tucked into a crisp manila folder, were complete but for one thing: my final signature. I closed the binder and dialed a number I hadn't used in 15 years. Silas Croft answered on the second ring. He had been a junior associate at my late husband's law firm, a man I remembered for his sharp intellect and an economy of words that bordered on unnerving. Now he ran his own practice. I told him I needed to execute an immediate and total revision of my estate. He didn't ask why. He simply said, 10:15. His office was a Spartan space above a pharmacy, devoid of any decoration save for a ticking grandfather clock. He met me at the door himself, his gaze as direct and unsparing as I remembered. I handed him the binder. "Everything with his name on it," I said, my voice even. "I want it frozen or removed." For the next hour, the only sounds were the rustle of paper and the ticking of the clock. Finally, he closed the binder and looked at me over the rim of his spectacles. "It's all yours, Eleonora," he stated. "Nothing has been filed with the state. Nothing is binding. It can all be retracted." I asked him what was required. "Step 1, he said, "a formal, written revocation of all transfer intentions. Step 2, a new protective trust that shields the assets from any future claims. Step 3, immediate designation of a new beneficiary." I instructed him to proceed with all 3. He promised drafts by noon. I left his office with a copy of the revocation letter and a profound, icy calm spreading through my chest. Back home, I took every page bearing Corbin's name and laid them out across the dining room table, a mosaic of his betrayal. Then I gathered them, slid them into a fresh envelope, and wrote in bold, black ink, "Void, do not process." By 3 o'clock, Silas emailed the new documents. The file was named Vance Restatement, Final. At 6:05, a mobile notary stood in my living room. I signed every page without a flicker of hesitation. When the door closed behind her, the house felt different, as if it had finally exhaled a breath it had been holding for years. In the gathering dark, I took the voided envelope, lit the corner of the topmost page with a match, and dropped it into the cold maw of the fireplace. I watched his name, his future, curl into ash and disappear. It wasn't revenge. It was a removal. It was the moment I stopped being a mother grieving a lost son and became a woman reclaiming her sovereignty. By Saturday morning, the new estate plan was locked away. Corbin Vance no longer existed within the financial architecture of my life. He was erased. The quiet of the ranch felt different now, not empty, but earned. I drove my truck into town and picked up the local paper. At the bottom of the front page was the small announcement I had submitted. Eleanora Vance, longtime resident of Whispering Bluffs and former military field nurse, has formally announced the establishment of the Sanctuary at Vance Creek, a foundation for women in crisis. The foundation, funded with a $15 million estate donation, will support community programs providing shelter, legal aid, and vocational training across the state. I read it twice, folded the paper, and laid it on the passenger seat. It was a small story, but it was the only one that mattered now. On the way home, I passed the small community church where I had volunteered for decades. I didn't go in. I simply sat in the truck, engine off, and looked at the familiar steeple against the vast Montana sky. There wasn't a whisper of doubt in my soul. This was not retribution. It was a course correction. I spent the afternoon in the garden, my hands in the dirt, and I waited. Just after 5, my phone began to ring. Corbin. I let it go to voicemail. He called again. I silenced it. Then a text. "We saw the paper. Can we come talk?" I didn't reply. An hour later, the gate camera sent an alert to my phone. His car was pulling into the long gravel driveway. I dried my hands on a towel and walked to the front door, opening it just as they reached the porch steps. Serafina wore a soft cashmere coat, her smile a carefully constructed artifice. Corbin lingered behind her, his head bowed. "Eleanora," she began, her voice dripping with a sweetness that felt poisonous. "What you've done, it's so incredibly generous, so inspiring." I said nothing, just stepped aside to let them in. And we sat at the same dining table. I hadn't moved the chairs. I wanted the memory to hang in the air between us. Serafina prattled on about community and legacy, her words a silken web meant to ensnare me. Then she leaned forward. "We were just wondering," she purred, "if it's all been formally filed. There might be a window to restructure things. Perhaps Corbin could manage the foundation, keep it in the family, protect the legacy." I listened until she was finished. Then I stood, went to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and returned. I looked directly into her cold, calculating eyes. "It's done," I said. The smile on her face didn't fall. It fractured. Corbin finally spoke, his voice thin. "I feel left out. I wanted a chance to make things right. This is our family's legacy." I took a slow sip of water. Serafina's composure shattered. "Do you have any idea what you've done to us?" she screeched, her voice sharp and ugly. "You've embarrassed us. You're being irrational and vindictive." She shot to her feet, the chair screeching backward on the floor. In one swift movement, she seized the soup tureen from the sideboard and hurled it at me. Cold vichyssoise splattered across my chest. As I stepped back, Corbin lunged, grabbing my arm, his fingers digging into my flesh. "Apologize to her," he demanded. "Apologize." I shook my head, and he raised his other hand to strike me again. That was when the front door opened. Iris, my ranch hand's daughter, stood in the entryway, her phone held high, its camera recording. She had been on the porch, having dropped off some mail. She said she saw them pull up and had a bad feeling. The moment she heard shouting, she hit record. Serafina froze, her face a pale mask of horror. Corbin dropped my arm as if it were on fire. "Iris," I said, my voice betraying no emotion. "Call the sheriff." She did, right there on speakerphone. By the time the two deputies arrived, Serafina was attempting to feign a dizzy spell, claiming the tureen had slipped. Corbin was trying to play the role of mediator, speaking of a family misunderstanding. But Iris handed them the phone, and I showed them the fresh, angry bruises already forming on my arm. Statements were taken. Reports were filed. They were escorted to 2 separate patrol cars. I locked the door behind them, cleaned the soup from the floor, and changed my shirt. Then I went to my study, opened the file folder labeled Final, and added a handwritten addendum to the trust agreement. No reinstatement under any circumstances, including emotional distress or coercion. What had happened wasn't about the soup. It was the final, irrefutable proof that to them, I had never been a mother. I had only ever been a vault. And the door to that vault had just been sealed forever. After the deputies left, the silence in the house was profound, clean. I didn't cry. I went straight to my study and opened a different file, one labeled Contingency Protocols. Inside were documents Silas had prepared weeks ago, emergency suspensions of financial access, revocations of power of attorney, all the brutal mechanics of legal separation. The situation had escalated. I called Silas's emergency line and left a clipped message. "The protocols are active. Execute immediately." By morning, he confirmed it was done. All access was severed. I drove to the courthouse wearing the navy blue blazer I'd worn to my husband's military honors ceremony. It felt like armor. I waited until my number was called, then stepped to the counter and filed for a restraining order against both Corbin and Serafina. I submitted the police report, Iris's video, and a signed affidavit from Silas. By noon, a judge had granted a temporary protective order. They were barred from my property, forbidden from any form of contact, and prohibited from filing any claim against the estate. It was signed, stamped, and complete. Back home, I printed a copy of the order and pinned it to the inside of the pantry door, a place I would see every morning, not a reminder of fear, but of finality. That evening, a car slowed at my gate. The new security system flagged the license plate, Corbin's, and automatically alerted the sheriff's department. A patrol car rolled up behind him before he could even get out. He left without incident. The following day, a reporter from the local paper called, having seen the police report. I declined to comment. The article ran anyway. The headline was stark: "Philanthropist survives assault by disinherited son." The whispers in town grew louder, but I slept more deeply that week than I had in years. 3 days later, Silas sent an email with a subject line that read, "You'll want to see this." Attached were court records from another state, 4 years old. The plaintiff was an elderly woman named Agnes Thorne. The defendant was Serafina. The documents outlined a classic case of financial elder abuse. Serafina had convinced the 78-year-old woman to invest her life savings, over $100,000, into a wellness startup that never materialized. The money vanished. Agnes Thorne passed away before the case could be resolved. Silas had found it with a simple interstate background check. A memory surfaced, a friend mentioning a cousin who had been swindled by a fiancé in Florida. A few phone calls later, I was speaking to a man named Julian Reed. His voice was weary but steady. He told me how Serafina had charmed him, convinced him to co-sign loans for a boutique that never opened, and then vanished 3 months before their wedding after he discovered she was courting a recently widowed, wealthy acquaintance. He had been waiting years for someone to ask. He emailed me a 3-page, signed statement that night. I added it to a growing file labeled Timeline. By the weekend, an unsigned letter was slid under my door. It was from Corbin. He claimed he knew nothing of her past, that he'd been blinded, that he was lost. He asked to meet me, alone. I folded the letter and put it in the file. I was not ready. There was one more piece of the puzzle, and I had a feeling it was about to fall into place. On Tuesday, Silas called. He'd passed the file to a senior reporter he trusted at the state's largest newspaper. She wanted to meet, not for a quote, but for the full story. We met at a diner the next day. Her name was Susan, and she had the tired, intelligent eyes of someone who had seen too much. She had read everything. She asked if I wanted to go on record. I said no, but she was free to print what was already public record. Before she left, she asked one final question. "Do you think he knew?" she asked quietly. "What she was?" I let the silence hang between us. "I think he saw the parts of her that he wanted to see," I said finally. He chose not to look at the rest, and by the time it got ugly, it was easier for him to defend the monster than to admit he'd invited it into our lives. The article came out 2 days later under the headline, "Pattern of Deceit. Foundation Benefactor Unwittingly Escapes Financial Predator." It laid out Serafina's history in stark, factual detail, quoting Julian's statement and referencing the case of Agnes Thorne. It spread like wildfire. By the end of the week, the DA's office informed me they were moving forward. Serafina was being prosecuted for felony assault and elder abuse. Silas, acting on my behalf, had filed a civil suit against Corbin for coercion and unlawful interference. The machine was now turning on its own, propelled by the weight of truth. Serafina was fired. Corbin was placed on indefinite leave. Their carefully curated world was imploding. The final communication from her was a 6-page, handwritten diatribe pushed through my mail slot, full of accusations and self-pity. I filed it away in the back of a cabinet, a relic from a life that was no longer mine. That night, a storm tore through the valley, but I slept through the wind and the rain, and in the morning, the sun rose over a landscape that was, for the first time in a long time, truly quiet. The tide had turned, and I hadn't had to raise my voice once. The collapse was swift. A neighbor sent me a photo of Corbin's car, loaded with boxes outside a cheap duplex. An alert from my financial monitoring system flagged the closure of their joint bank account for insufficient funds. The expensive furniture, much of it gifts from me, appeared in blurry photos on online marketplaces. Then came the letter, left at the gate, in Corbin's changed, uncertain handwriting. Serafina was gone. She'd packed 2 bags and left without a word. He wrote that the silence in his small apartment was unbearable. He said he'd read the articles and believed every word. He didn't want money or forgiveness. He just wanted to sit on the porch one last time. I filed the letter away and did not respond. I thought of the boy with scraped knees, the young man who wept at his father's funeral, and the son who struck my face. There are countless versions of the people we love, but in the end, we are forced to reckon with the one they choose to become. The deputy called on a Thursday. Corbin had requested a supervised visit. 10 minutes, neutral ground. I agreed. I met him in a small, bare room at the county station. He looked diminished, his posture stooped, his eyes hollow. He said he didn't know where to begin. that he didn't recognize the man he had become in those moments of fury. He said he was sorry. I let his apology hang in the sterile air. Then he asked the question I knew was coming. Can you ever forgive me? I looked at my only child, the stranger sitting across from me, and spoke the hardest truth of my life. Corbin, I forgave you the moment I decided to save myself. But forgiveness doesn't reopen a closed door. The 10 minutes were up. He stood, thanked me for coming, and walked out. The door clicked shut behind him. Driving home, I felt a profound weariness. The deep bone ache that comes only after a long war is truly over. The house was still but not empty. It was full of my own presence, my own peace. A week later, a letter arrived from the County Women's Outreach Center. It was a thank you note from a counselor, detailing the new programs the sanctuary at Vance Creek had made possible. A support group for elderly women, a transportation fund for mothers re-entering the workforce, a free legal clinic. She wrote that the support was being felt quietly in rooms where healing was beginning. I pinned the letter to the corkboard above my desk, replacing a long list of things I once had to do for others. My legacy was no longer about bloodlines or property lines. It was about creating safe harbors for those who, like me, had weathered a terrible storm. I thought of all the loud, angry voices that had filled the last year, and I thought of how little they had actually said. Silence, I had learned, was a language all its own. That evening I sat on the back porch in my husband's old rocking chair and watched the sun dip below the jagged peaks of the mountains. I had been erased, dismissed, and broken. But in the wreckage I had found something that could never be taken away, the unshakable knowledge of my own worth. It wasn't a victory born of anger, but a peace forged in the fires of betrayal. I had lost a son, but I had reclaimed myself. And in the quiet hum of the evening, surrounded by the land that was now a sanctuary for others, I knew, with absolute certainty, that it was the best trade I had ever made. The wind moved through the pines, and for the first time it sounded not like a lament, but like a deep, contented breath.